Welcome to The Road. This is a weekly podcast of All Saints Lutheran Church. I'm your host, John Pedersen, and I serve as pastor. Each week, we reflect on faith, life, and navigating the road ahead. The language of journey is common when we think about life. It has its joys and challenges along the way, and we all need a little encouragement and guidance at times to keep us going. There's a word in the Bible, asphalia, which means truth, but it's the same root word we use in English for asphalt, if you can believe that. It's a solid surface that makes travel easier and more assured. And so every week we're going to be exploring elements of faith and life that keep us on the road. Faith isn't about living a perfect life. It's about finding our way, getting through rough spots, but seeking out those great vistas too. You can find my weekly message here, but you'll also find special conversations with guests who have insights on things like wellness, parenting, and living with unique purpose. If you appreciate this podcast, remember to subscribe where possible and share it with a friend. Here's this week's message. Well, we're continuing our series by faith, and on that topic, what is it that draws you to faith? What is it that draws you to faith? It's worth reflecting on. People give many different responses to that question. Depending on your own life experience, your particular faith tradition, what you were taught growing up, what you're seeking today, you may even find that you give slightly different responses to that over the course of your life. Some common reasons people give for their devotion may include that sense of ultimate meaning and purpose that it provides, values, a sense of right and wrong, hope, healing, as we talked about in our reading for today, a place of belonging, of peace, of love and compassion, of shared action and belief, a place to learn, to reflect more deeply on what it is to be a whole person through the eyes of sacred texts that have timeless insight, and of course, the assurance and promise of life eternal. I'm confident all of you could come up with yet more reasons you would mention it in terms of what draws you to faith. This past week, we gathered to honor the life of Dave Hansen, one of our longtime members, and it was wonderful to see some of our own members step up to help host the luncheon and make the service possible as well. There's just a deep sense of grace in all of that when a community comes together to support a family in need, to offer comfort and healing during a time of grief, and it's not to be taken for granted. And that leads into a simpler way of thinking about what we look to faith for. There may be many specific reasons that we give, but all of those reasons could be condensed down into two basic ones: instruction and grace. And by using those two words, I'm honoring both responses. You could also say law and grace. We tend to have a more negative association with the word law. But the Hebrew word for instruction is Torah. Torah can be translated as instruction or law. And the Torah refers to the first 5 books of the Bible or Old Testament in which God provides instruction and law to his people. Instruction at its core is a gift. You know, as a parent, when you try to impart wisdom and lessons to your kids, it's mainly out of love for them and wanting them to be safe and to thrive. But in addition to instruction or law, there's also grace. And in our own Christian tradition, the scale always gets tipped towards grace. There is peace and joy to be experienced in grace. Grace in biblical terms is often talked about as forgiveness and mercy. God extends grace to us whether we realize we need it yet or not for missing the mark. You might go for periods of time thinking you've got it all figured out, but life has a way of humbling us all. In time, if we're honest, all of us will see areas where we've fallen short, we've missed something, we caused hurt, we decided to go against better wisdom and do something our way, and it didn't turn out well for us or others. When we've recognized that and started to feel the regret or pain of that is when God's grace comes as welcome relief. But that form of grace is really just one. Grace can also be expressed in compassion and kindness from others. like what the Good Samaritan did for the man beaten on the side of the road. Grace can be experienced in the gift of friendship and community through a word of hope offered to us, in music that inspires or resonates with our experience somehow. Grace can be experienced in the simple gift of life, in the presence of creation and its beauty. There are countless forms of grace. So to restate my opening question today, what draws you to faith? Instruction, law, or grace? It's an important question, I think, to answer because that answer will shape community. It shapes attitudes and religious expression and piety. And there's a place for both. Again, in our tradition, we believe in this life that you can't focus exclusively on just one or the other. Both have an important place, but it's the tendency of humans to lean, in the end, on the side of law, usually. And I'll use that more loaded word now. And Christians and religion in general sometimes get knocked for wielding the law or harsh rules. And often, it can be deserved. Somewhere along the line, gracious and warm-hearted instruction can turn into what feels like a kind of weapon or punishment. When the law is raised up without any spirit of grace, it can become oppressive. But legalism and extreme reliance on law or formula or right thinking or living is not the sole propriety of religion, okay? David Zoll, in his book Seculosity, makes a great case for how people in the absence of traditional faith and religion simply turn to all kinds of other things as religion. Anything from romance to parenting to busyness to technology, work, leisure, food, politics, and you can go on. The list is almost infinite. Anything we become rigid and single-minded about can become legalistic and oppressive in the end. Leaving behind religion doesn't free you from it. It can just lead you to more narrow and less developed forms of it. And so Jesus does something interesting in today's reading, and it goes to the heart of his teaching and spirit. Jesus cuts through the rigidity and legalism that he was encountering in his day, and he brings grace. Again, in today's gospel, we hear this: just then there appeared a woman with a spirit that had weakened her for 18 years, bent over, quite unable to stand up straight. It's interesting that the description is that she had a spirit that had affected her physically. And it might be helpful to imagine what life was like for this woman. It had to be painful. She had been bent over for 18 years. Imagine just the physical pain of that. It would have impacted her not just physically, but socially and emotionally as well. In the ancient world, there was an assumption that if you were ailing from something, it usually had a spiritual connection. If you were in bad shape physically, you were probably failing, in fact, somehow spiritually. So there may have been some judgments made about this woman. And socially for her, there may have been a continuing experience of exclusion or shame. But Jesus effectively welcomes this woman back into the grace of community. Not to mention offers the actual gracious act of healing. When he laid his hands on her immediately, she stood up straight and began praising God. Jesus says, "You are set free from your ailment." And later at the end of the story, he says she has been set free from her bondage on the Sabbath day. This woman has received freedom. So as we reflect on the point of faith and what Christian faith is about, Jesus stated it very clearly in John 10:10, "I came that they may have life and have it abundantly." When you're constrained and limited, you can't experience the fullness of life. By setting this woman free, she can now experience life fully. That's an act of healing and an act of grace. Her response is praise, but that's not the only reaction to what Jesus does. The leader of the synagogue was indignant because Jesus had cured on the Sabbath. There was this whole set of laws that talk about the particularities of what you can and can't do on the Sabbath, a day to rest and honor God. You're not supposed to work. Might be helpful first to get inside the mind of this leader of the synagogue, because when we read the story, we're quick to judge him, but appreciate for a moment where he's coming from. I mean, what he wants is simple. He's someone who just wants clarity about the rules. I mean, can you relate to that at times? He's in charge of overseeing things in the synagogue. He's responsible for making sure things go well. Jesus seems to just have upended all of that, kind of messed it up. The system and structure is being called into question. Rabbi, Messiah, whatever he is, he's contradicting the law, it would seem. This isn't the only time Jesus is accused of breaking the Sabbath. Now, you can get into a lot of details here in terms of what precisely was the Sabbath law, and in fact, it's questionable whether the attack that Jesus is getting in this reading actually is grounded in what the Sabbath law was, but that was what this leader was interpreting it as at that moment. So Jesus was once asked what the most important commandment was in the context of, especially today as we're thinking through particular laws about the Sabbath. His response was, love God, love your neighbor. That's what's most important. All the commandments are summed up in those two phrases, and even one simpler word, love. When Jesus has the opportunity in the synagogue to either obey Sabbath rules or bring life, the choice is obvious. He doesn't really break the commandment. He fulfills, actually, the spirit of it. If we want to hold to the law, we have to understand the spirit of it, or else we can actually be doing the opposite, really, of what God intended. The Lutheran tradition has a rich understanding of the distinction between law and gospel or grace. The law is everything we should and shouldn't do, and the gospel is everything that God does for us freely. The law has some important functions. It protects us, and it also points out where we fall short. It, at times, can seem punitive, but the law isn't the ultimate goal in our relationship with God. The law, at best, is just a guardian so that we can experience God's presence and grace in the end. In our Lutheran tradition, what we've made clear is that anyone who thinks they excel when it comes to living up to God's law is fooling themselves. Usually when we think we're doing great and we're moral standouts, the reason is that we've focused on certain areas where we do well and blocked out other areas where we don't so much. It represents at best a lack of awareness of where we fall short, not only in what we do, but in what we don't do. And that's what Jesus sees as he hears the words of the synagogue leader who's chastising him. He can't let this irony go unnoticed. Jesus says, "You hypocrites, don't each of you on the Sabbath untie your ox or donkey and lead it away to give it water? And yet you don't think a person should be freed from what is binding her?" I give the leader of the synagogue the benefit of the doubt. He probably has good intentions. He's doing what he knows. He's trying to be faithful and applying what he was taught was right and wrong. The intent of keeping the Sabbath is to remember God, to curb our need for more and more, to work yet another day, to get more. So why should you take a day off of work and rest? So you don't think that the world revolves around you. That unless you keep going on, somehow the world won't go on. But you can live on what 6 days of work gets you. It's enough. The Sabbath day was made for our sake, not for God's sake, to rest and to help restore us to life. That's the spirit and the gift of the Sabbath. The problem in this story we heard is that this religious leader has missed the larger point, the spirit of it. He assumes his purpose and everyone's is to live the letter of the law, but in doing so, he's missed the spirit. Jesus has freed this woman from her ailment, and he has now freed the crowd from their captivity to the letter of the law. The synagogue leader probably wanted to stir up opposition to Jesus and reinforce the law, but instead, it says the entire crowd was rejoicing at all the wonderful things that he was doing. They feel liberated too. Whatever opponents Jesus had are silenced, and it's not just the woman who's freed, but it's the crowd too. The result is joy. The people are experiencing life, and that's why Jesus came. Jesus removes the barrier of the law that God gave in order to bring life, because he said himself that was the whole point for why he came in the first place. That's something leaders in organizations can do. If there's a process that's not serving a purpose in an organization, a leader can remove that and free a team to act and do something new. Even parents can do this. You set up rules for your kids. You make them for a reason, maybe to protect them, maybe to teach them something, but sometimes you need to re-examine the spirit of those rules and determine if they need some revision. Following Jesus requires us to walk by faith, to embrace the spirit at the heart of the law rather than the law itself. And some people confuse that. Christian faith is not ultimately a devotion to law, especially not the letter of the law, but to God, a person. And we see God through Jesus, whose desire is that we might have life abundantly. We find instruction and wisdom through the teachings of Jesus, but again and again, we give thanks that we are also set free by the grace of God. Amen. That's this week's message. You don't have to navigate the road ahead alone. You can join with others at All Saints. Visit allsaintsmtka.org for more information. Have a great week.